Great. We reconvene regular council meeting at 7 o'clock, and we are starting our regular council meeting with a delegation from Greg Netzroff at the history of the Pioneer Arena, going through some of our past and then next steps of what we're hoping to do with some of this information to celebrate the history that is there. So if you want to come on up, and Mr. Briscoe will help you with your presentation. Welcome. Thank you for doing all this for us. I look forward to your presentation. I know the last time you came and presented, I learned lots. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I think you know the rundown. Been here before. I make sure the mic is nice and close and everyone can hear you. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Thank you. I was asked to put together some history of the Pioneer Arena, which has an interesting story. Some parts of it you will definitely be familiar with, and other parts maybe not so much. It is a story of community spirit and volunteerism, but also perseverance. By no means was this an easy accomplishment. I don't want to give the impression that people were jumping at the chance to work on this building, because that really wasn't the case. And in fact, at times it looked like it would never be finished. It ultimately took 13 years to complete, in fits and starts. So this is a story that starts in April of 1949 with the formation of the Castlegar and District Project Society. And this is their letterhead, which I absolutely adore. I think this was drawn by a local artist named Joe Kushner. There were lots of people who were involved in this organization over the years, mostly men, but certainly some women as well, and I'll talk about some of them later. The society was formed because Cominco at the time was offering money for recreational projects if the community could raise half as much. But the society didn't know initially what they wanted to do with that money or what they wanted to build. They thought about a swimming pool, a new community hall, a library, a ballpark, or an ice rink. And they started with a ballpark, and they bought land for that in 1951. And then the following year, they took on the ice rink as their next major challenge. Because there were lots of kids, especially, who wanted to play hockey or figure skate, but they had to travel to Nelson or Trail to do so. So they spent a lot of time debating what the rink would look like, but ultimately they wanted it to be similar to something that was in Fernie. They expected it would cost between $140,000 and $175,000. And that's about the equivalent of between $1.5 million and $2 million today. And it was expected to include a skating rink, a curling rink, dressing rooms, and meeting rooms. But first of all, they had to figure out where to put it. And one location they quickly identified was Block 51 along Columbia Avenue, which you might recall from a presentation that Mr. Barlow gave last year was originally earmarked for a cemetery. And it was first mentioned as being set aside for that purpose in 1944. And then after Castlegar incorporated a few years later, the property was turned over to the village. But the commissions of the day in Castlegar and in Kinnaird felt it maybe wasn't such a great spot for a cemetery after all, and that it might be used for other purposes. In 1953, the local Eagles Lodge approached the village of Castlegar about buying the property, but they were turned down. And then at the end of that year, the village officially earmarked the land for the arena project. And at that point, the society already had $30,000 available, but they figured they'd need an equal amount to complete the first stage of the building, which would just be the shell. And then they need another $50,000 for the interior and $80,000 for the ice plant. But they hoped to use a lot of volunteer labor to keep costs down. And so they started clearing the site, and they set up a fundraising clock on Columbia Avenue to keep track of their progress. And they had canvassers going door to door, collecting monthly pledges and signing up members and potential volunteers. And people who worked at Cominco had the option of contributing through payroll deduction. And in exchange, they'd get a discount on a season pass. Now, you've seen this image before. It's out of the Nelson Daily News. And it shows that the original plan called for an L-shaped building, including a 4-sheet curling rink and space for the library. And I think a Vancouver architect named Robert Bennett was responsible for this sketch. But when it appeared in the newspaper, the Nelson architecture firm of Williams and Fairbank asked for an opportunity to work on the project. And so they drew up some plans. But then they got into some sort of conflict with the society. I think the society was worried that they'd be on the hook for paying for the plans even if they didn't end up using them. So they went in a different direction. While the project was expected to use volunteer labor, there was a contractor involved, L.R. Lewis Construction of Calgary, and they also ended up designing the building, much to the dismay of Fairbank architects. And in April of 1956, the Project Society signed a contract with L.R. Lewis just to do the shell of the building. And the plans that were seen here had to be approved by the engineering department of Cominco before they would agree to contribute any funding. And the plans called for an aluminum roof supported by 21 wooden arches that were ordered from the Dring Laminated Arch Company of Manitoba. L.R. Lewis Construction was to provide a supervisor, a foreman, and the tools and equipment. And the society, in turn, had to supply the rest of the labor, which was estimated at 5,000 hours. And while they waited for the arches to arrive, the building committee finished leveling and backfilling the site and pouring the foundations. About 125 volunteers provided 1,200 hours of labor for this part of the project. The Kiwanis Club pitched in. Reportedly, students 15 and up who donated at least 44 hours of work received half-season skating passes. They also did another fundraising blitz, which was not very successful, so they tried again. This time, they hit up employees at Cominco and what was then the Castlegar sawmill, now Interfor. And this time, they had better luck. So the arches arrived by train on July 14th, 1956, and it took a week to unload and truck them to the site. And then they had to nail several thousand pieces of 2x4x4 cleats onto the arches, jack them up, bolt them together, and prepare them to be raised. And it took 30 to 35 men per day to do that work. We have a pretty good sequence of photos of this portion of the project that I'll just cycle through here. Sign says help wanted. So raising the first end plate required a tripod of poles, blocks, and a cat, and it was very slow going. But afterward, the remaining arches were a lot easier. And by August the 10th, they were all in place. And then the next big job was shiplapping the roof. However, as with any project, there are frustrations and setbacks. And at this point, the volunteer pool started to dry up. So the society set up a recruiting station in the fire hall, and they started calling every organization they could think of, saying, come help. And they had some success, but not a whole lot. A news story explained how the society felt bitter disappointment at the lack of interest shown by people in the construction of the new rink. And some of the society's directors were said to have been regretting their involvement, and there was concern that things might be on the verge of falling apart. So one thing they did was they turned to the high school and they asked them to make students available to help. And so some of them did in place of their PE class, and others came after school. And this is my favorite bit of trivia about the entire project. To reward any student who provided at least 10 hours of work, the Rotary and Kiwanis clubs offered milkshakes and banana splits. And another source that was tapped was the local Doukhobor community, who had lots of carpentry and building expertise, and they supplied work parties. And this is a sheet that tallied the volunteer hours that was kept. So Art Anderson led the way among the adults. He put in 151 hours. Robert Lytle Jr. was tops among students with 100 hours, and the Horning family had the most combined hours with 265. This is a Gordon Pettit photo of Castlegar, probably in the late 1950s, that doesn't really have anything to do with anything except that it gives you an idea of what the community looked like at the time. The site of the Pioneer Arena is just out of view, but the old City Hall is bottom right. You can see the fire hall tower. So by October 5th, 1956, the shiplap was in place and the aluminum roof was completed on October 29th in a race against the weather. In their year-end report, the Project Society wrote that it was due to the unremitting efforts of a few men that we won this race, and that today the shining dome of our rink stands in defiance of the snow. However, there was a dispute with the contractor. The Project Society withheld $400 from its final payment because the foreman and supervisor weren't present for some of the work. Contractor saw things a little differently. They said the society failed to meet its obligation of providing 8 workers each day and finishing the grading of the site. And that meant that their foreman had to stay on the job several weeks longer than anticipated. So I couldn't figure out how they resolved that dispute. There's no sign that the society paid the balance, but there's also no sign that it went to court. So they were able to use the arena for the first time that winter of 1956-57. But they were not able to complete the end walls or hang the doors. And so it was essentially a sheltered outdoor rink with natural ice. The next phase was to add those missing items as well as lighting, washrooms, and dressing rooms. Fortunately, the society now said that there was a feeling of optimism and vigor that had previously been lacking. They still had money coming in from Cominco employees through payroll deductions. There was 159 workers signed up by that time, each giving $1 or $2 a month. But they needed more money, so they appealed to Cominco and to Castlegar for further contributions. Castlegar gave $1,000 to complete the wiring, and the Kiwanis Club came up with another $2,000. In December of 1958, after a year of work, they finished the overhead lighting and the power connections. I'm not sure when the end walls went up, wasn't until 1960 or later. However, the winter of 1957-58 was so mild that the season was a total write-off, and they weren't able to use the arena at all. So what they really wanted was artificial ice. And they looked at various options and how much it might cost. And here's a newspaper ad encouraging that effort. It says, "Contact Bob Fenner at Bob's Pay and Take It," which is where the Element nightclub or the Woods nightclub was. Another newspaper ad, "Put an arena plant or put an ice plant in the arena. How you can help. Be interested, active, and enthusiastic in your support. Give as much financial support as you possibly can now. Offer to help our canvas, attend our annual meeting in the Marlene Hotel, etc., etc." This is a letter that went out to various community organizations asking groups to endorse the idea of artificial ice. And here is a pledge card to the Ice Plant Trust Fund. And then came a stroke of good fortune. In early 1959, the Project Society caught wind of a 56-ton refrigeration plant that Eaton's was going to be getting rid of from their cafeteria in Vancouver. And it was only 15 or 20 years old. So the society offered $1,000 for it, and the offer was accepted. But they then had the challenge of getting it here, because it was up to them to have the thing disassembled and trucked to Castlegar and unloaded and then reassembled with volunteer labor, which, as you can imagine, it took a while. Plus, they had to lay piping under the ice, so it was a big job. And these are photos of the plant arriving at the arena and being prepared for installation. At this point, the fundraising efforts had been exhausted, so they got a $3,000 loan from Castlegar Savings to buy the pipes. And artificial ice was finally in place in March of 1960 for a 3-week trial. And they had the grand opening on November the 12th, 1960. And I haven't been able to find any photos of that opening, unfortunately. And from then on, the arena was home to general skating, minor hockey, figure skating, and broomball, among other things. Public skating cost 15 cents for kids, 25 cents for students, and 35 cents for adults. And here's the rink when it's all finished in the early 1960s. And then to complement the ice surface, in 1962, a community hall was completed on the second story. And for the previous decade, there had not really been any meeting space in Castlegar after what was known as the Coronation Hall on the present site of City Hall was demolished, even though it was less than 20 years old. So to inaugurate the new hall in the arena, they held a dance that drew 700 people. I don't know how they fit them all in. All along, though, the plan had been for the village to take over the operation of the arena from the Project Society, but the village preferred to wait until the debt on the building had been retired. And in the fall of 1963, the village began the process of the transfer, but the society operated it for one more season, hoping to deal with the remaining $4,800 that they had to pay off. The village each year gave them a modest operating grant, but most of their revenue came from ice rentals. Now, something I haven't mentioned is that part of the arena was devoted to a 3-sheet curling rink, which is now the mini ice. And here are some of the curlers in 1960. There was always a bit of friction between the Project Society and the curling club because, well, I won't get into it, but I mean, it came to a head in 1963 when the Project Society wanted to rent the ice out on a per game basis rather than for a lump sum as they'd been doing before. So the curling club decided to sit out a season entirely, and that also got them thinking about building a separate but adjacent curling facility. And in 1964, the curling club applied to buy part of the property to build that rink. However, there was a problem, and if you'll indulge me for a minute to go off on a bit of a nerdy tangent. One of the village commissioners claimed that the land had never been released from an agreement designating it as a cemetery, and that it was never rezoned for recreation. But from my reading of it, they did exactly that in December of 1953. It was just that a decade later, they couldn't find the bylaw or the motion. And so the village approached the Department of Municipal Affairs, who said that a special act of the legislature had to be passed to fix that, and that it wouldn't happen until the spring of 1965. And so that would hold up any expansion or improvements on the site. But I couldn't find any evidence of such an act being adopted, so I think they probably later on just realized, well, it wasn't an issue, or they found the bylaw. But still, the separate curling rink wasn't completed until 1973. The village finally took over management of the arena from the Project Society in the fall of 1964. I don't know what the balance sheet looked like at that point, but the society then dissolved after 15 years having done its job. As I mentioned, there were lots of people involved in this project in the arena, hundreds who contributed in some way, and many who served on the Project Society board itself. However, a couple of families who were recognized at the time were the Clarks and the Thorpes, and that's John and Ev Clark of Clark's Pool fame, as well as Walter and Barb Thorpe. And when John Clark was named Citizen of the Year in 1960, they referred to him as Mr. Arena, because he'd helped install and maintain the ice plant, and he'd been the manager, the janitor, and as this story says, the hot dog dispenser. The rink meant new possibilities for teams that could represent Castlegar, and this is a Pitts Drugs hockey team from 1960. The same year, the Rosslyn Warriors of the Senior Western International Hockey League thought about moving to Castlegar. Not quite sure what their motivation was, but it didn't happen anyway. A junior team, though, materialized in 1966. The Selkirk College Saints played in the West Kootenay Junior League and called the arena home. But then the league folded after 1 year. When the league reemerged in 1969, Castlegar had a new team. And this is another piece of trivia that I enjoy. It was called the Apollos. And this is the only photo that I know of the team, although it's taken from microfilms, so it doesn't look very good. But a couple interesting things about this team. Their roster was made up exclusively of local players. One of them was John Horkoff, the father of Sean Horkoff, recently named to the BC Hockey Hall of Fame. And the team's manager was a guy named Lawrence Chernoff. That Lawrence Chernoff. And he told me that their games were absolutely jam-packed, and they drew 300 plus fans per game to an arena that was never really designed for spectator sports. There's no glass around the rink either to prevent anybody from being hit with a puck. Despite the enthusiasm that the team enjoyed, they only lasted until midway through their second season, and at that point they were in last place and the sun set on the Apollos. But as a side note, a number of years ago, the Station Museum hosted an exhibit on Castlegar's sporting history, and the holy grail of artifacts that they were trying to find was an Apollo's sweater, which did not materialize, and as far as I know, I don't think one has surfaced since. At any rate, Castlegar was then without a junior hockey team until the rec complex was completed in 1976, and the Rebels were born. And at that point, Castlegar had 2 ice surfaces, and for a long time, both were used pretty much to capacity. In those years, there were close to 500 kids in minor hockey alone, plus figure skating, plus a commercial hockey league, plus an old-timers league. In the mid-1970s, the regional district assumed responsibility for the arena's management and programming. And now that there were 2 arenas, the original one became known just as the old arena. And sometime in the 80s or the 90s, there was a contest to give the building a more fitting name. And former Recreation Director Pat Medge told me that he remembers Colin Price had the winning suggestion of the Pioneer Arena in recognition of the people who built it. And then in the 80s, a renovation of the building took place in partnership with the Carpenters Union. The union provided the labor to reinforce the roof with metal beams, it built concrete dressing rooms to replace the wooden ones, and the community hall on the 2nd floor was turned into an AA clubhouse known as the Castellano Club. But by the 2000s, the building was showing its age. An assessment in 2009 indicated it was on borrowed time. The following year, City Council voted that if the RDCK ever terminated its lease on the arena, the city would demolish the building. And that fall, residents voted in a referendum that included adding a 2nd sheet of ice to the complex, which failed. The lease on the Pioneer has since expired, but the arena is still standing. In 2016, a recreation master plan recommended that the arena be decommissioned once it was deemed unsafe. Another referendum was held in 2018 on building a 2nd sheet of ice at the complex, and it too was defeated. Although city residents and Area J residents voted in favor, it failed for a lack of support in Area I. In 2020, City Council passed an in-camera motion that said it would pursue a health campus for the property that took priority over the arena, and that the arena would be demolished to make way for it, even if there was no immediate plan to build another ice service. And that brings us to today. In 2023, as you all know, the city announced plans to redevelop the site, and we're now 16 years beyond the point when it was decided that no major capital improvements would be completed on the Pioneer Arena. And if there were any major equipment failures, that would be it. So even in its twilight years, the Pioneer has provided yeoman's service. It is a venerable building that has served its community well for nearly 70 years. I'd take any questions.
Wow. Thank you, Greg. Again, I would really just want